want to be eventually bound. So we're going to have the string, the name of the category, and a float with the percentage for the expenses in this particular category. Which means that what I will eventually be binding to the list view is going to be an observable collection of category expenses, not of strings. So I will go ahead and create yet another observable collection. This one of category expenses. This is going to be category expenses collection. So I will just make sure, by the way, that I initialize this because I have been forgetting to do that. So my category expenses collection is going to be equal to a new observable collection of category expenses. Next, right after getting the categories, I want to get the expenses per category. So I have created a new method that is going to go ahead and search for all of the expenses in the local database per category. For this, I will actually create a new getExpenses method in the expense model. But this one is going to be requiring the category. So what I'm basically going to do in here is still going to get the expense table, but I am going to filter the results, which I can do through a where clause in here. What I can do is search the expenses where the category is equal to the category that I am currently receiving in this method. And this query is going to be translated into a list as always. But this is easy, I can just filter the expenses for this particular category. This method is the one that I will use over here. So all I have to do is actually iterate through each of the categories, which I can do through the observable collection of categories that I already have, and get the expenses for that category by calling from the expense class the getExpenses method and pass that category. And I can get a new float of the expenses amount in category by from the expenses, which is now going to be a list of expenses, call a method that for which I'm going to be requiring a link, by the way. So I will add a using directive to system.link, and from the expenses then call the sum method. And what I want to add is the amount, of course. So this method is very handy. I will go ahead and grab the amount for each of the expenses and add it together. So this one is going to be the expenses amount in the current category, but I am not really binding or requesting the amount. I want the percentage related to the total expenses. So what I will actually do is create yet another method in the expenses model that is going to be returning a float, and that is going to be total expenses amount. And then what I will do is from this list, I will do the same thing. I will actually need a link again. And from the list that I am getting, which is unfiltered, notice, I am going to call the sum, and again going to get all of the expenses, the amount on those expenses, and just return that sum. So I will be from the view model before the for each loop, I'm going to get the total expenses amount by calling from the expense the total expenses amount. So now I have that, which means that I can now get the percentage. Now in here, what I will do is create a category expenses variable, which is going to be equal to new category expenses, of course. And this is going to have in the category, well, the category that I'm in this particular iteration working with. And after the category, I can set the expenses percentage to be equal to the expenses amount in category divided by the total expenses amount, just like this. And of course, I will have to add it to my category expenses collection by simply calling the add method and passing this CE variable. Just like this, I'm also getting the expenses per category, which means that I will now be able to, in the view, bind everything to this new observable collection. So let me go ahead and do that. I will first, of course, need that namespace reference to my view models, set this new resource. In the list view, I am going to set the item source to be binding to that static resource. And of course, the path will have to be this category expenses collection, which means that now each and every one of the view cells is going to be receiving a category expenses object. And each category expenses object contains a category and an expenses percentage. So in the label, I will be able to set the text to be binding to the category property of that class, and the progress bar has a progress property that is going to be binding to the expenses percentage, like this. Which means that if I run this, we should see actually currently only one of the categories contains some value, probably 100%, because that's the only one that has, right, indeed we have a coffee one, but you do see how now each and every one of these view cells, which by the way need some margins in here, but you can see how we see each and every one of the categories and only one of them with some percentage. Let me actually go ahead and add that margin to the stack layout, which is going to be 16 to the sides only. Let me run again, and we see this working a bit better. Now, our application seems to be quite ready. Now, there are still a few things that we need to change here and there, but we could say that our application is working perfectly. In the next couple of lectures, what I'm going to do is actually change a little bit about how this form looks. Because while this looks okay and this works perfectly, there is a better way in which maybe in some scenarios you will have to actually implement that way of doing that. Now, because that way of doing that I'm going to introduce to you in the next lecture does unfortunately not contain some way of binding to it, we will learn how to bind programmatically from C#, which is going to be another interesting thing to take a look at.